Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. This month's guest is Dr. Manon Hedenborg White. Manon holds a PhD in the history of religions from Uppsala University and is the author of The Eloquent Blood, the Goddess Babylon, and the Construction of Femininities in Western Esotericism. She is now finishing up with a 3-year postdoctoral project funded by the Swedish Research Council called Power Through Closeness, Female Authority and Agency in a Male-Led New Religion. And today, Manon will be sharing some of her research findings with us. For a full list of Manon's academic activities, of which there are many, please visit her page at academia.edu. In part 1, Manon shares a bit of information about her project and what motivated her to start looking into the lives of 3 women within Thelema and how the project has been going so far. She then gives a quite extensive biographical background of each of the women she's researching, Leah Hirsig, Jane Wolfe, and Marjorie Cameron, and how they came to Thelema and their fascinating roles within this group. Okay, welcome to the podcast, Manon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I'm very happy to be able to talk to you again, and this time about your postdoc research project. You are looking into the lives of 3 women, Leah Hirsig, Jane Wolfe, and Marjorie Cameron, that played major roles, each in their own ways, I guess I should say, within Thelema. And so I'm certain that there's a lot to unpack here. But before we get into the details of your research, could you talk briefly about your project and what motivated you to start looking into the lives of these women?
Right. Yes, definitely. So this is something, as you said, this is my postdoc research project. It's, I've been working on it for the past 3 years. It started in the summer of 2018, and I'm actually really nearing the end of it now. Formally, the project ends at the end of June in 2021. So I'm really kind of staring down the barrel of finishing everything. But yes, as you said, it is a comparative analysis of 3 women within the history of Aleister Crowley's religion, Thelema, in the 20th century, who played important roles within that tradition in different ways, you could say. And how I came to be working on this was I wrote my doctoral dissertation also on Crowley's Thelema and the reception of some of his ideas up until today. So in that book, I was looking at the various interpretations of this goddess Babylon, who's one of the main deities in Crowley's Thelema, and the ways in which this symbol has been interpreted from Crowley and by some of his leading followers and up until the present. So what kind of struck me when I was working on the historical portion of my doctoral dissertation was that I was looking at all these historical source texts which were written by persons like Crowley, but also Crowley's follower and disciple John Whiteside Parsons, Jack Parsons, whom we're going to be discussing a little bit later on, who was in the United States and who was kind of one of Crowley's early followers there, but also very much a devotee of Babylon. Also someone like Kenneth Grant, who was Crowley's secretary briefly towards the end of his life and then kind of went on to create his own really intricate, really complex, interesting magical system and theory as well, and who also kind of described this idea of Babylon and attributed various functions to her. So what I thought was interesting about these historical writings were that, this was a feminine symbol, this is a goddess, but most of the kind of more sort of elaborate, explicit writings about this symbol were by male occultists, basically, who were working with her. But looking at, for instance, someone like Crowley, I mean, there were women around him who incarnated this idea of Babylon, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that as well, a little further down the line. But so what were these women thinking, and how were they experiencing these ideas, and what did they mean to them? So that kind of that kind of led me to want to shift the focus from kind of the level of symbols and deities to the level of, actual men and women, and kind of how they experienced this sort of fringy religious movement at different point in time. So that was basically the background for what I've been doing for the past 3 years.
Right. Okay. Well, that is fascinating in and of itself. So that's, we have a little bit of a framework in the way that you're working. But with regard to your research methods, how have you been researching the lives of these women, and how has it been going? Has it been easygoing? Has it been challenging?
Well, it's been a bit of both. So in contrast to my doctoral research, that combined both historical methods with ethnography and interviews. So this project that I've been doing now, my postdoc, that has been all historical. So it's been mostly looking at unpublished archival materials, but also cross-reading, cross-referencing those things like letters and diaries by these three women, but also the people around them, some of Crowley's other followers in the early Thelemic movement, and also kind of cross-comparing that to the various sort of published biographies and memoirs that are in existence. It's been really good in a lot of ways. I've had support from private collectors and people who have their own private archives and organizations that do. Mm-hmm. That part has been really, really good. People have been very sort of generous in terms of sharing material, and for that I'm really grateful. It's also been, it's also involved a little bit of course, like sort of detective work in kind of a way, I would say, like in terms of Jane Wolfe and Marjorie Cameron, we know quite a lot about what they did. So Cameron, for instance, was the subject of a biography by a journalist named Spencer Cancer a few years back. It doesn't cover everything, but, it does give kind of an outline. Her time with Parsons, of course, has been quite sort of extensively chronicled in the various biographies of him. In terms of Jane Wolfe, there hasn't been really... both Wolfe and Cameron, there hasn't really been that much academic interest as of yet, but Jane Wolfe, given the importance that she held for such a long time, has been her diaries, for instance, from the Abbey of Thelema, we're going to be talking about that period soon, have been published. There's been a memoir or a biography of Jane Wolfe as well that was published a couple of years ago by Red Flame Publications. So there have been a few things like that. So we know fairly well what Cameron and Wolfe did. In terms of Leah Hirsig, there's the period when she's with Crowley and when she's traveling with him and the other Thelemites. That's been, there's a lot of source material for that period. So in terms of what I've been doing there, because there haven't been biographies of her to that extent. So in terms of that material, I've been really sort of tracing her steps, kind of. But also there are some pretty substantial areas where we don't really know what she did in terms of before her first meetings with Crowley. And I've been trying to dig into this, and there's been others who've been trying to dig into this as well. There's actually a German historian named Lucas Vogel who wrote a biographical novel about Leah, which was published, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. And he's been digging into this as well for many, many years, and he hasn't really found that there's not that much to be found about Leah's life prior to Crowley. So in terms of kind of figuring out who she was, I mean, we know some things. We know she was born in Switzerland. We know she emigrated to the United States at the age of 2 with her mother and sisters. We know kind of her addresses. We know she was a school teacher, but we don't really know who she socialized with, her interests, those types of things. So in terms of retracing her steps during those years, it's kind of been partly an issue of also trying to understand what was life like for an unmarried woman or an unmarried mother, as she also was, and who was a school teacher living in New York City. And, based on that sort of information, or say the fact that she moved to Greenwich Village, we can make some educated guesses about the sort of person that she was, but we can't really know for sure, and we might never know for sure. It's possible that the material has just been lost, or it'll turn up in somebody's attic 15 years down the line. So so those type of challenges, but that's also what makes it so exciting and so fascinating. I mean, I'm always living in hope of finding, even a tiny clue that will just say something more. I think I find that so fascinating.
Sure. Yeah, I can understand that it's very difficult to fill in the gaps of periods of time. Yeah. So maybe there will be some kind of find in someone's old dusty attic. There'll be some letters or something like that. You never know. Exactly. You never know.
No, so, okay. Right. That's
well, as far as the research that you have been able to perform and to carry out, the three women that you're researching, they all have their own unique stories, of course. So I would like to start out with an introduction of sorts for each of them. So if you could talk about how each woman came to find their way to Thelema in whatever form that took, and what their roles were within their respective groups, then we can kind of start to get a little bit of a background about the women themselves.
Yeah. So I'm just going to proceed chronologically then.
Sure,
that
great.
Seems to, or it's it's partly chronological in terms of actually Jane Wolfe being the one who was born earliest. But I'm going to start with Leah Hirsig because she comes into kind of the center of things just slightly earlier.
Okay.
So she was so Leah was born in 1883. As I said, she was born in Switzerland, and her mother and sisters, they emigrated to New York City. She grew up there, seemingly a slightly sort of bohemian household. The Hirsig girls' mother, Magdalena, encouraged them to be very creative and to kind of pursue independent lives, which most of them did in one way or the other. They tended to marry quite late, or they didn't marry at all. Most of them didn't have children. Many of them had kind of sort of highly educated jobs or creative jobs in various ways. So she trained to be a school teacher. She was a teacher of music. She taught at various schools in the Bronx for a number of years. In 1917, she gave birth to a son, Hans Hammond. We don't know who the father is. He was known as Hansi throughout his early childhood. And in 1918, she appears to have had her first meeting with Aleister Crowley, which was very brief and didn't really lead to much. In 1919, she came back. She visited him at his studio in Greenwich Village. And at that time, she was looking for accommodation in Greenwich Village. She was taking law classes during the evenings. She was tired of working as a school teacher. But her and Crowley became lovers, and they developed a very sort of intense connection. They moved in together very quickly, and thus also began her magical involvement. And she started keeping her first magical diary around this time as well. In the autumn of 1919, Leah and Crowley both they went back to Europe along separate routes, and they reconvened in France in early 1920. By that point, Leah was pregnant with Crowley's daughter, and she was also bringing her young son. And they kind of, through sort of circuitous routes, they both arrived at Cefalù on the north coast of Sicily, where they together jointly established what would be known as the Abbey of Thelema, which was a Thelemic commune with where some of Crowley's leading disciples would reside periodically over the next few years. And in the summer of, so Leah was also Crowley's, of course, magical partner through this, and also his partner in sexual magic, which was something that he was working with a lot during this time. So in the summer of 1920, Crowley came to the realization that Leah was his Scarlet Woman, which was a very important thing. So the Scarlet Woman was a title that he bestowed on some of his most important female lovers and magical partners. The first of them was his first wife, Rose Kelly, who assisted Crowley in the reception of the Book of the Law, so the most important sacred text of Thelema, essentially. And after that, he also gave that title to various other women who helped him in magically and in various ways. And a lot of these women had in common that they had sort of visionary abilities or kind of channeling abilities. So that's one of the things that Leah did as well. She transmitted messages from kind of other than human spiritual entities, and she also helped Crowley interpret passages from his texts in various ways. And they also practiced more intensely different forms of sexual magic together during that summer of 1920. So they embarked upon a series of experiments where Crowley took a vow of what he called holy obedience to Leah. So she was kind of the dominant party there very much. And they went into this kind of sadomasochistic, gender-bending, very transgressive exploration of various kinds. And throughout this, they were also discussing magic together. Crowley was also, during this time, during 1920, he was working on trying to produce an explanatory comment to the Book of the Law, which was something that he'd been struggling with for many years. And he enlisted Leah to help him, as well as the other disciples at the Abbey as well, among them Jane Wolfe, whom we're going to be talking about shortly. So she helped him with this, but she also helped with, she was also kind of in charge of daily routine at the Abbey when Crowley was elsewhere. He tended to travel back and forth to the mainland quite a bit. So during that time, she would strike the gong in the morning. She would recite the law of Thelema, do what thou ought to be the whole of the law. She would lead the other residents at the Abbey in various forms of ritual, and she would kind of assign daily duties to the other residents at the Abbey. So she had a very central role there. What I also forgot to say about this role of the Scarlet Woman is that Crowley and the Thelemites also had the idea that the Scarlet Woman is the human embodiment or avatar of the goddess Babylon. And that's something that, compared to the other Scarlet Women, that becomes very apparent in the ways that Leah eventually writes about herself in her diaries, but also the ways that Crowley writes about her. When he writes about her kind of in the context of these sex magical experiments, she's this almost divine figure. She's very sort of elevated, and she's very kind of impressive to him. So that's something that really comes through. But over the next few years, she also came to a rise to a number of formal titles in the early Thelemic movement. So within Crowley's order AA, which was his magical sort of training order, which combined yogic techniques with the ceremonial magical practices he'd been trained in within the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and of course his own Thelemic holy books as well. Leah eventually held the title of Praemonstratrix, which is one of three kind of governing positions. She was also Grand Secretary General of Ordo Templi Orientis for a while as well, and she also held kind of this sort of formal position, and for a few years she was essentially sort of Crowley's right-hand woman. She was very instrumental in transmitting his orders to other Thelemites, and summoning them from various places and requesting funds to be sent, and kind of coordinating things. She was also she was good with money, and she was good with math. So she was often in charge of the finances as well. And she also went through magical transformations and initiations of her own. So for instance, in Crowley's AA, she arose to the degree of Magister Templi, which is one of the highest degrees, and designates traditionally someone who has obliterated their ego and become a perfect vessel for the divine will, essentially. She also had visions that informed Crowley's continued work on the comment to the Book of the Law. So in 1923, Crowley was expelled by order of the Italian authorities after one of his disciples at the abbey had died, and very negative media attention around this sequence of events. So he embarked for Tunis, and Leah joined him for a while, and they took a magical retirement in the autumn of 1923. And she has a series of very sort of colorful, strange visions at the same time as he's working on one of his other attempts to a commentary to the Book of the Law. So you can sort of see her magical revelations and visions kind of informing the magical work that he's doing during that time as well. Eventually, around the turn of the year of 1923, beginning of 1924, they both went back to Europe. She stayed for a while at the Abbey of Thelema. He, of course, could not go back there. But she took a leading role again. She had some students of her own in magic as well. Eventually, they rejoined in France. And in the summer of 1924, Crowley found a new Scarlet Woman in a Chicago-born woman who was called Dorothy Olson, and whom he took as his new lover. And Leah was very distressed. Crowley essentially kind of skipped town with his new lover, and she was sort of left to process what had happened. And this, of course, aside from the fact that there was, she was experiencing this very sort of deep, romantic, emotional turmoil and distress. It also meant a very real shift of status in terms of the Thelemic movement for her as well, because she'd been Crowley's chosen one and sort of right-hand woman, second in command, and suddenly she was the ex-Scarlet Woman, which was kind of a tricky territory to inhabit in many ways. So she, during this period from the autumn of 24, she keeps these very intense magical diaries as well, where she is trying to work out what has happened. She's keeping up this daily magical practice and doing meditations. She practiced sexual magic on her own, but also with other partners. And she's trying to figure out what's happened. So one of the things that she does is that she resigns the title of Scarlet Woman, or she kind of passes the torch to Dorothy Olson in her own mind, but she claims the title of the goddess Babylon instead. So she writes that Dorothy is now the new Scarlet Woman, basically, but I am Babylon, and thereby she is my magical daughter. So she kind of, in a sense, places herself almost on equal footing with Crowley. But it's not really clear to what extent any of the other Thelemites really paid much attention to this. She was working closely through this period with one of Crowley's other disciples, a man called Norman Mudd, and they kind of, I think, experimented with these roles to some extent. And she also had various ideas about Norman Mudd being her magical son and various things. But she grew a little bit more. She wasn't really kind of in the center of things with Crowley during that time. During the early spring of 1925, Crowley summoned Leah to Tunis, where he was staying with Dorothy Olson. And she went and she assisted them in various ways. Dorothy Olson at this time was having magical visions of her own. And there in Tunis, Leah also became pregnant again, this time by one of Crowley's other male disciples, a William George Barron. But she was left, she's keeping her magical diaries during this period, and she was left again in Tunis when Crowley and Dorothy went back to the mainland, and she didn't have any funds to return for a while. So her diary from the spring of 1925 is quite interesting, because you can see this growing disillusionment. She's actually getting quite annoyed with Crowley as a man. She's still committed to him as the prophet of a religion, but she's sort of saying that, it's difficult for her to look past this when this mundane man is also treating her not very nicely. Eventually, she was able to go back to Europe anyway. She continued to support Crowley for a number of years, but she went to, after giving birth to her son in December of 1925, she went to stay with relatives in Switzerland. She went there in the spring of 26, and that appears to have been. Before that, she was staying in Germany. She was staying with Martha Kunzel, who was a very loyal female disciple of Crowley's as well, who lived in Leipzig. She was staying there with Norman Mard also. They were both staying with Kunzel. And during this period, Mard also becomes increasingly disillusioned with Crowley and kind of cuts ties with him, and Crowley kind of reciprocates by sort of excommunicating Mard effectively. And after Leah departs for Switzerland in early 1926, that seems to be her last spot of face-to-face contact with any of the other Thelemites. She stayed in contact with them via correspondence, and she was sort of a Thelemite in good standing up until the summer of 1927. But there does appear to be some sort of disillusionment growingly during this period, because in the summer of 1927, in August, she suddenly writes to Crowley and demands that he prove the divine, more than human origin of the Book of the Law, and thereby also his status as the prophet of Thelema. And she asks him to substantiate those claims, essentially. And Crowley wasn't very happy about this. He responded basically that, you know, you've committed a transgression by discussing the contents of the Book of the Law in this way. You are cut off from all communication with this milieu until you reaffirm your loyalty. And she didn't take that very well. So she responded by recanting all support of him and kind of submitting her resignation, essentially, from Thelema as a movement. And that's really sort of the end of it. She sends another letter to Crowley in 1929 where she withdraws any claim to the title of Scarlet Woman. And once again, she writes to him in 1930. At this point, she's clearly traveling with Norman Mudd. They're in Escorial in North Spain. And the letter this is a very weird letter. It's in Mudd's handwriting, but it's signed by her. And it's almost in this sort of legalese, which was kind of typical of Mudd, but that's a different story, where she kind of asks Crowley to perform some sort of ceremony nullifying any magical oaths that she has taken to him, and then to like confirm in some way to Leah that he's performed this ceremony. We can only speculate as to the reasons for this letter and why she sent it several years after she'd actually had any response from Crowley himself. But that was the last of it, and by that point she completely vanishes from the Thelemic movement. And at this point, again, speaking about these sort of uncertain areas in Leah's history, after that she gets a lot more difficult to trace. From what we can see, she remained in Europe. She never went back to the United States. She traveled a little bit around Europe, but she stayed mostly in Switzerland and kept that as her main base. And she went back to teaching as a school teacher again. And she doesn't seem to have had any other contact with Thelema after 1930, or for that matter, we don't know anything about her having any contact with any other esoteric or occult groups either, which is kind of remarkable for someone who had that level of magical involvement and practice for quite a few years. But this is sort of what I've gleaned from interviewing surviving relatives of her who knew her later in life. So that's Leah's story. woman number two, so Jane Wolfe, who's actually, there's some overlapping chronology here.
Okay.
So she was actually born, she was 8 years older than Leah. She was born in 1875. And she was born in Pennsylvania, but before meeting Crowley, she was a character actress in Hollywood. And she was she was in quite a few films. She's mostly famous, I think, for starring as, not as Rebecca, but in the film Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm as one of the minor characters. And she developed over time interest in esotericism. She dabbled in spirit communication and spiritualism. She had connections to theosophy as well. And she was introduced to Aleister Crowley's works in 1917 while working in Hollywood. And she began working with some of the practices. So she did pranayama, for instance, so breathing meditation. And in 1919, she started corresponding with Crowley, and that really that was really a defining moment, of course, in her magical career, because she quite shortly thereafter, only the next year in 1920, she gave up her acting job to travel to Europe and join Crowley at the Abbey of Thelema. And she was, based on their correspondence from this time, it was quite sort of passionate. Before kind of deciding that Leah Hirsig was going to be his Scarlet Woman, it seems that, or Crowley definitely was considering whether this Jane Wolfe, this mysterious beauty from Hollywood whom he'd never met, was actually the next bearer of the Scarlet Woman title. And it seems that she was kind of interested in this kind of great love affair with this prophet of Thelema as well. And it didn't turn out that way. So they had kind of unfavorable first impressions, both of them, of each other. Crowley thought Jane Wolfe looked old, which is funny because they were the same age. And Jane Wolfe came to the Abbey, and actually the first person to greet her was Leah Hirsig, and she thought Leah was dirty and her clothes were filthy, and she thought they were living in squalor, basically. And she was a bit shocked at this new place that she'd come to, and it took her a while to kind of get used to things. Her and Leah didn't like each other that much in the beginning. There was kind of a barrier between them. But eventually she did get into the spirit of things, and she was initiated into Crowley's AA, and she went into this very rigorous magical training program that the residents at the Abbey all went through. One of the things that she did was she took a month-long retirement on the beach, a magical retirement on the beach of Cefalù, where she was meditating and isolating herself from social contact, so very intense. So in the spring of 1923, around this time when Crowley's disciple Raoul Loveday died at the Abbey, Jane was dispatched to London as Crowley's personal representative to kind of handle matters with the press and also with Raoul Loveday's family. And she also worked for a while. She lived with Norman Mudd for a while. They were lovers. She was his personal secretary for some time. And she continued to kind of assist Crowley in various ways. She traveled with him periodically over the next few years. And eventually she returned to the United States in 1927. And this is when she becomes hugely important in terms of kind of creating a link between the Thelemites in Europe and kind of an emerging Thelemic community in Southern California. So from 1927 and up until Crowley's death in 1924, they had a very close correspondence, hundreds and hundreds of letters where they write to each other, and it kind of very much on a first name basis. So she was a close friend of Crowley's, although she was never his lover. And they kept this up, and these letters are they're really interesting as well, because Crowley, he's very familiar with her, and it's very clear that there's a lot of affection, and there's a very strong friendship bond. But he is also kind of treating her as his emissary to the Thelemites in Southern California. So he's quite demanding, and he's quite whiny at times as well. She's getting a lot of the burden of his when he's annoyed with the other Thelemites, and he's kind of telling her, do this, you should set this up. Why aren't you sending more money? Why aren't you telling such and such person not to do this? You're the one who knows how things are to be done. You get them in line, basically. So in Southern California, Jane Wolfe, together with Wilfred Talbot Smith, who was another one of Crowley's disciples, in North America, they kind of co-established what would become the Agape Lodge of Ordo Templi Orientis, which first existed in Los Angeles on Winona Boulevard, and would later relocate to Pasadena, which would be the only functioning OTO body at the time of Crowley's death, and which over time also came to sort of practice this kind of communal living structure like they had done at the Abbey of Thelema, with a fair bit of partner swapping and partying and drugs, but also rigorous magical study involved. And in that community, Jane Wolfe had a very key function as kind of the living link between Aleister Crowley, who was getting quite old at this time, and she was as well, of course, born in. Now we're talking early 1940s. So she's approaching, she's getting on there a bit. But she was very, very key in kind of transmitting also her own experiences and descriptions of how Crowley had done things at the Abbey of Thelema and ritual structures and things like that. And Crowley died in 1947. Jane Wolfe remained committed to Thelema until her death in 1958, and she also had magical students of her own. So she had a much longer kind of involvement in Thelema than did Leah Hirsig, and very different as well in terms of, she was never Crowley's lover, she was never his Scarlet Woman, but she had this very central role as an organizer and as a kind of a bearer of tradition, you could say. So the third woman is Marjorie Cameron. She's was a lot younger than the other two. She was born in 1922 in Belle Plaine, Iowa. And she was an illustrator and a cartographer. And she came into Thelema via a slightly different path. So she got wrapped up in things at the Agape Lodge, which during this time was based in Pasadena. And in 1946, she began a love affair with John Whiteside Parsons, whom I was talking about earlier, who was a rocket scientist and a follower of Crowley's as well, and who was at this point the lodge master of the Agape Lodge as well, and the owner of the house where they were all of the lodge members were living. So Parsons was a very interesting character. He was a very enthusiastic follower of Crowley's ideas, but he was also a romantic and a bit sort of impatient, and tended towards wanting to kind of skip ahead in the magical curriculum and do more kind of grandiose experiments. So by his own account, in the early spring of 1946, he was seeking a magical partner, what he called an elemental mate, or the female incarnation of an elemental spirit. So he was doing invocations to try to conjure this sort of spirit. And he was, of course, famously assisted in these operations by L. Ron Hubbard, who would go on to found Dianetics and Scientology, and whom Parsons felt was a very magically sensitive, thelemically inclined individual. Crowley, on the other side of the Atlantic, was a bit urged caution, but Parsons wasn't really a man of caution. So one night, the two men went into the Mojave Desert. They went to Parsons' favorite spot at the intersection of two power lines, and he felt a sense of tension, and then a sense of release, and a sense that the work had been accomplished. And they went back to Pasadena and to the lodge house, and found waiting on their doorstep a 24-year-old striking tall woman with flaming red hair, And this was Marjorie Cameron. And Parsons writes that he instantly recognized her as the elemental spirit that he'd been waiting for. So that's his version. Her version is slightly more prosaic, according to her, and I think this is the version to believe to some extent. She had visited the house of the Agape Lodge a year previously, and she'd seen Parsons talking on the phone. They'd caught each other's eye, but they had not spoken. But she was aware of the house before, and she, of course, had not materialized out of thin air. But anyway, they launched into a very passionate affair. Parsons saw this affair as being very magically significant and as being part of what he referred to as the Babylon working, which was this whole series of magical operations performing to create a human physical manifestation of the goddess Babylon that he wanted to incarnate on Earth. So after meeting on the doorstep of the Agape Lodge, they spent the next 2 weeks together in bed. Cameron saw this as the beginning of a love affair. Parsons saw it as a series of sex magical experiments, but she wasn't very concerned with his esoteric occult interests at this time, and she didn't really care about that. But they grew closer around this time as well. Hubbard departed the Agape Lodge with Parsons' other girlfriend. And
there's a whole story behind that.
There's a whole story behind that. We're not going to go into that now. But anyway, this around the same time, Parsons submitted his resignation to Crowley. He stepped down as the head of the Agape Lodge, and they sold the house in Pasadena and moved out. And he moved to Manhattan Beach with Cameron, and they got married late in 1946. Next few years, they had a bit of a tempestuous relationship, which was on and off. She went abroad periodically. She lived in Mexico, in San Miguel de Allende, which was kind of an artistic haven during this time. And over time, she did get more involved in magic and Thelema. So by 1949, Parsons was tutoring Cameron in magic while she was staying abroad, and writing extensive letters to her where he's teaching her about mythology and astrology and the tarot. And he was also coming to believe that she had a key role to fulfill in the destiny of humanity, and her interests grew. So 1952, in June, Cameron and Jack Parsons are scheduled to go to Mexico. He, of course, died in the aftermaths of an explosion in his home laboratory on the same day that they were scheduled to leave, which is very sad kind of chain of events around that as well. Cameron was devastated, of course, and she departed for Mexico, where she dabbled with spiritualism with an English couple who was staying there. She went back to the US a couple of months after that, where she continued her sort of study of Thelema more intensely. She was also studying Parsons's papers from the Babylon working and starting to really think about for herself what these experiments meant and what her role was. And she was starting to think herself during this time that she might have been this prophesized avatar of Babylon that Parsons had been trying to produce. She also went in the winter of 1952 to stay in an abandoned ranch in Beaumont, California, where she took a sort of vision quest. She was using a lot of psychedelics, and she was also creating art, and she was also sort of collecting a kind of bohemian art circle of artists and musician friends of hers that she was practicing magic together with as well. She created a circle that she called the Children, where she orchestrated these sex magical experiments, where she wanted to produce a new race or a magical child, essentially. So she paired men of color with white women in sex magical rituals, and she had increasingly these kind of apocalyptic ideas. She was also interested in UFOs. She had some sort of idea about a coming race war. So she was kind of this sort of iconic figure in this very loose kind of cluster of bohemian artists, occultists, essentially. But during this time, she also developed a very close bond with Jane Wolfe, who seems to have acted as a sort of magical mentor to Cameron, and who also, and as a sounding board for Cameron's visions and experiences, basically. So Cameron did not have the kind of formal organizational involvement that Leah or Jane had in Crowley's magical orders, but she did have this sort of practice and interest of her own, which she continued throughout the rest of her life. She continued to develop as an artist, and she also explored astrological and esoteric themes in her artistic works. And she also corresponded with Joseph Campbell. She was interested in his idea of the hero's journey, and she also created her own illustrated journals around that theme. But she continued to be kind of engaged with Crowley's Thelema and with Crowley's ideas and throughout the rest of her life, basically, but in a more sort of individualistic kind of way than the previous two, I would say. So that wasn't necessarily a brief introduction, but that was...
No matter. I was quite enthralled to hear you talk about all of this.
Good.
Please join us for part 2, where Manon talks about how these women were perceived within the organization, her term, proximal authority, plus the influence and impact that these women have had on Thelema and beyond.